Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 3rd of August, and in today's video we're looking at numerous advances. We're going to begin by looking at the Tri-Oblast border region between Zaprozhia, Dnipro, and Donetsk. We'll also zoom in on the current clashes south of Pokrovsk, but more importantly north of Rodinska, which plays a huge role in how and when the agglomeration in Mirnorod and Pokrovsk will end up falling. So we're going to analyze that as well as the battle unfolding east of Seversk as the Russians get very close to entering the semi limits. We're also going to look at the Leman direction, and I'll pull up a tweet that I wrote today that explains in depth my sort of analysis of the situation and the way in which things can unfold going into the future. I'll also look at Kupiansk, and then I would like to finish off by zooming in on Zaprozhia, where we have a couple of updates, and Kherson, because I want to look at the bridge over there that's been targeted and what may be unfolding in that particular direction. But let's begin by zooming in on the border region. Here it's between Zaprozhia and Donetsk. You can see actually that in yellow we have the polygons indicating Russian advances over the past 48 hours. You can see that we have 3 separate polygons. This one in between Vilna Pola and Shevchenko amounts to 1.5 square kilometers. You can see this one north of Zelenopole amounts to 1.83 square kilometers. And then this is the largest one between, what is that, Novodarivka and also Novopil, Tamarivka, etc., 10.3 square kilometers. So the Russian forces, in essence, are just closing in on a lot of the salients that have been forming. And these salients are not based around or anchored around any sort of major fortification system or any sort of settlement where troops could reasonably defend within basements and use that as cover overnight. But we're not seeing any of that manifest right now. We're not seeing that the Ukrainians are able to hold out in those sort of salients. Instead, they have these very small squads that are embedded in tree lines that barely have any sort of fortification work done, that aren't actually able to defend against intense drone assaults. So a drone can hit the trench or the dugout or whatever it may be, and it would already cause structural damage to the defensive work. It's not connected to any sort of wider fortification system. You can see over here, these are actual layered defenses that have that sort of quality that I'm describing, in the sense that they are able to absorb attacks from drones, even from artillery strikes. They are multifaceted. They have several components, so like anti tank mines, anti personnel mines, dragon's teeth, barbed wire, anti tank ditches, and then compounded over sort of like a large space. They're all connected together. So that's in stark contrast to the sort of fortifications that we have that we can't even see via satellite imagery in between these tree lines. So that's where the Ukrainians, and they're largely from territorial defense units like the 122nd and 110th, they are trying to hold out in this particular region. Obviously, now the Russians, they've been able to evade the sight of the Ukrainian drone crews and have been able to take over these open areas and arrive at the border. What this means is that the Russians are now at the entrance, the precipice of arriving at the really well fortified defensive structure that I just described, that is supposed to be the first layer of defense holding out against a frontal assault towards the deeper portions of Zaporozhia, the final, I believe, 28% of Zaporozhia that remains under Ukrainian control, and in particular Huliapoli, which is a very important Ukrainian logistics hub. It serves as the nexus for all of the Ukrainian defense across this sort of eastern part of Zaporozhia. The western node would be Orkiv, and you could see that's also a part of the Russian thinking, that they want to take out this particular garrison and remove the Ukrainian advantage that they've been able to accrue by basing their forces out of there. But that's still in very long term. Huliapoli, though, you look at the eastern flank and you look at the way in which the defenses were built, and they did not anticipate the Ukrainians that they would be having an attack that sort of comes in from this eastern direction, that they would be flanked from the east. And it does reduce the efficacy of some of these defenses that were built with the intention of defending against a frontal assault coming in from the south. So that sort of undermining of the Ukrainian defense line before it can even be properly utilized against a head-on attack is a part of why the Russians are even exploiting this gap in the first place. And this is a gap because the entire region between Velika Novosilka and the border region is pretty open. It's an area that was not well fortified by the Ukrainians. And I was calling this out a year and a half ago. I was warning and really talking about how, in hindsight, it would end up being a mistake. Now you can see that the Russians were able to exploit this particular gap, and they are able to flank these defenses as a result. They could also arrive at the second layer of defenses that run from Dnipro all the way into Zaprozhia and act as a second layer of defense against like key hubs like Melnik over here, which serves as an artillery hub for the Ukrainian side, or Zarichny, Komishuvacha. The line, list goes on. So this is another area, and obviously it's complemented by various villages that are running along key paved roads. All of them are under threat from this eastern direction as a result. And sort of the natural connecting point within Dnipro, southern Dnipro, would be Pokrovsk. You look at the elevation around it, it's very low lying. It's the nexus between a lot of highways. So certainly that is within the Russian purview, although I do think due to the distance, due to the fact that the Russians are known to switch up the sort of locations that they attack every couple of months where they put in the most emphasis. And Novopavlivka, actually, in terms of the amount of assaults, is very close to being number one. The two parts of the front line that have incurred the most Russian assaults have been Pokrovsk, Leman, and Novopavlivka. So yes, it's pretty much up there. And at some point, we've seen this with other parts of the front line. Within Donetsk, the Russians do reduce the tempo and redeploy forces due to trying to find new weak points. And so the Ukrainians will be hoping that they can achieve such a status quo near the border over here, including via the utilization of these defense lines over here, although, as I described, it will be difficult, and through natural barriers like the Vavcha River near some key towns like Havrylivka and Ivanivka, hoping that that would bag down the Russians and make them sort of opt to look somewhere else that would be more conducive for a deeper advance. So that's the Ukrainian rationale. But for the time being, we're not going to see this advance stop because the Russians are still in the process of clearing out all these undesirable salients, which would include Komishuvacha over here and all of the nearby fields within Donetsk, the eastern part of the border. And then from there, it's difficult because you can't really see a natural dividing point, because then it would naturally feed into various other villages that are within Dnipro that are small in stature and pretty much disconnected from Pokrovsk by the Vavch River and by a long distance. So those areas would also obviously be really threatened by that as well. Same thing with the entire line of villages that are running along this river. I don't know its name, that connects all the way to Malanivka. I do think that regardless of the short term sort of tempo of the attacks, fundamentally, there is an issue with holding on over there because of the new eastern flank that the Russians have built, which is why the entire Velika Novosibirsk operation has been so significant and has changed the course of this front. You look at this area over here, just clearing out a bit of a small salient in the direction of Komishuvaka. And then here near Vosrosenka, the Ukrainians are naturally dragging out the fighting because they do want to ensure that the salients exist for as long as possible, with the intention of then giving them time to build up on the rear and prepare for the eventual collapse of the salients in such a manner that would just give them enough time to sort of build up forces and further acclimate themselves to a new fallback line. So that's the rationale behind it, and it is uh, only possible because of drone crews. It would simply be impossible if the Ukrainians did not have certain drone crews that were flying and hovering above the skies, spotting Russian forces leaving areas like Mirny or Komar in their efforts to arrive at the front line, and then sort of striking them before they're able to actually arrive there. That's what's been sort of halting and reducing the tempo by a bit, and that's the reason why the salients still exist to the extent that they do. And you can see over here that the Ukrainians in areas that are the most threatening, that are the closest to key villages or to key towns like Ivanivka and Havrylivka, that they do want to retain control over because it gives them a very strong glue and a strong operating point near the front line and near some of the lower lying regions that the Russians are basically going to seize over the coming weeks due to the eastern bank of the river falling into their hands, as you guys can see. But the Ukrainians are trying to delay that. And that's why we have over here this video. It amounts to 0.5 square kilometers of territory captured, but the Bratstvo battalion of the main intelligence directorates of the Ukrainian side, they were able to take back this farm area and the warehouses that are just to the west of Zeleny High. And this was done in order to just create some breathing space between the roads and the river leading into Ivanivka. So here you can see the Bratstvo battalion. I now have them marked on the map as being deployed to this area. But regardless, Zeleny High itself still remains under Russian control. And you can see how there are a couple more salients that I do think are under grave threat in the coming weeks. You look over here at the region that's near Dnipro and Donetsk, sort of the Novopavlivka direction from the east, you could refer to it. And finally the salient, because there used to be a massive salient over here. We talked about it. It's finally been closed, and that's for the same reasons that all the other salients that I've been describing are now coming to a conclusion, because eventually troops gets sort of stretched thin and the manpower runs out near the front line. It becomes even dangerous to transport reinforcements or to evacuate casualties through this area. The skies become very exposed, even though the Ukrainian drone crews are very active, due to the fact that they are sort of an salient. The drone crews can't actually operate from inside that salient because it would simply be impossible. There are no basements, there are no fortified areas to any sort of significant degree besides the trenches over here that are way too close to the Russian lines. So then they have to operate near Novopavlivka. So they're just at a disadvantage from the get-go compared to the Russians, who could have drone crews operating out of Bakhtir or Loksivka for that matter. And that's at a much closer range, and it gives them a much better response time. So eventually, all of those compounding factors allowed the Russians to clear out the salient, and now they're basically in the process of just taking over the border fortifications. They want to take over the anti-tank ditch over here that separates the Dnipro. And then from there, everything will be in place for an eventual assault towards Novopavlivka, which for the time being, they've been able to stymie the Ukrainians from the southern direction, which is a positive development. But now, as the final sort of obstacles to the east are falling, this will have to be the new center of Ukrainian attention, which is why the 46th Air Assault Brigade is now deployed to this area yet again and is engaging in very intense fighting. This is geolocation indicated in advance of 10.7 square kilometers, and it's from August 3rd. It's from the 46th Brigade conducting numerous FPV strikes on infantry, on vehicles, on Russian dugouts, and on trenches, all of them being north of Novoukrayinka in this case. So a lot of the trenches that the Ukrainians held out in, and that's part of why they were able to resist over here for so long, they've been seized. And now the Russians have actually been able to reach the anti-tank ditch that separates the two oblasts. So it's going to be important for the Ukrainians to try to drag out the fighting for as long as possible, because after that fortified area, there is a corridor that is completely open, does not contain any massive fortifications, whether they be an anti-tank ditch or even a infantry trench. And you could see it over here. It's about a 9-kilometer push from the southeast, so it is a significant amount of territory to pass through for Ukrainian drone crews that will be the spots. But as with every other town that has fallen so far, there eventually reaches a critical mass. And at that point, there's no sort of backup plan, because the infantry definitely don't have the ability to respond to multiple flanks at once. They've been able to really address concerns in one area by deploying reinforcements to Dakhni, and in the process, essentially stabilizing the front line, initially counterattacking and such, but doing so at the same time and in tandem across a much broader front line to the east, that's simply going to be untenable. So that's why the Russians are now sort of converging around Novopavlivka and creating all the conducive conditions needed to assault it. So I would definitely keep an eye out for that part of the front line. You look over here at the situation near Pokrovsk. The Russian forces have been able to take over part of the fortified area that's north of the Chensk and Zelene, but not all of it. You can see over here that advance amounts to 1 square kilometer nearly, and it's a part of the Russian process right now, because you do have forces, I believe, from 35th Motor Rifle Brigade engaged in fierce fighting to just clear out individual fortifications, and they want to just expel the Ukrainians from their forward positions in Lasivka, and they're doing so from the west now. Because Lasivka acts as a sore thumb, it's preventing a lot of mobility by the Russian forces in the area north of Selidove. So they would just want to rid Lasivka of its defensive capacity. And then from there, the Russian forces would have a lot of freedom of activity throughout this entire open region. It would be a great sort of triangular location for DRGs to operate and move from Yernurha to Pokrovsk in tandem. So that's one Russian prong, but it's not the main one by any means. I'm just mentioning it because we saw the advance over here today. Obviously, the main center and focus of Russian DRGs remains on southern Pokrovsk, although I don't have a way to really detail a way in which it's changed since the last video. For now, I'm just going to maintain the same front line, although it is true that we've been able to receive reports recently that the Russians are gaining steam in the Zelenivka microdistrict towards Shakhtarsky, so now their presence over here has heightened. What I'm going to say, though, about this part of the front line is that there's information out about a new air assault unit that's been deployed to this area that had previously not been operating in the Pokrovsk front. So we know that the main defenders of the city include the 68th Jaeger Brigade, the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, some elements of the 3rd Spartan National Guard Brigade, although that's limited, 155th Mechanized Brigade, and then 25th Airborne Brigade. And on paper, that's a lot, but in reality, 32nd Brigade had massive shortfalls in infantry, and that's a part of why the initial breakthrough occurred in the middle of July. So that's definitely something that we need to take into account when adding up the numbers. And a lot of these units, the sort of most potent force ends up being the drone crew. And once you arrive at a state where you're engaged in DRGs passing through, the urban part of the city, that's when the DRGs, or rather the FPV crews, do have some of their benefits sort of reduced, because at that point it's easier for troops to move from one place to another and seek cover when you're engaged in fighting through an open field or through some of these tree lines around Troyanda or maybe north of Shevchenko. That's an area where deer or FPV crews can sort of flourish and stop a lot of attacks on their track. But once that sort of phase passes by and the fighting actually enters into a dense urban cluster, that's when the drone crews can only do so much, and you need infantry on the ground to engage with those forces head on. So that's why reinforcements are so important, and we've simply have not seen enough of them. We just have not. Uh, you look over here at the one major brigade that's been moved over here, and it is the 92nd Assault Brigade. And I'm not even sure whether the entirety of the unit was moved over. It was previously operating in Sumy, by the way, but we know that at least a third battalion is fighting over here. And I've been looking through a lot of Ukrainian Facebook channels recently to just get an idea of which units are actually operating over here around Pokrovsk. And it's pretty much similar to what I've been describing in recent videos. I just look through the missing persons reports and look at like the location where they were claimed to be missing and the date in which they got lost. A lot of them actually coming from the 2nd Galician National Guard Brigade, which is defending basically the eastern approaches to Mirhorod. So they're pretty active around here. But 92nd Brigade may have been moved over here in its entirety, at least one battalion. That's simply not enough, because you're looking at reinforcements that are needed for the Rodinska sector, obviously. You need reinforcements for Mirhorod and definitely for Pokrovsk. That's the area where it's definitely pressing, at least to the same degree as what we're seeing with Rodinska and Belitska itself. So the fact that there's perhaps one other brigade being moved in, that in and of itself, the fact that there's only one that's being speculated about, definitely is a cause for concern, because not even that's confirmed, and that would be the full extent of the reinforcements if it's true. So which brigade is it? Well, it's from the Air Assault Corps, so either the 7th or 8th Army Corps. And just looking through, there's probably like 4 candidates. It could either be the 71st, 77th, 79th, or 80th Air Assault Brigades. I'm not sure which one it is, because you look at all of them and they have a pretty recent record of operating along other parts of the front line. 71st is currently in Sumy. 77th, I believe, is operating in the Kharkiv region near the border with Luhansk. 79th, they are currently operating in Sumy as well. So they've basically formed this grouping, the 8th Corps of air assault units that are all fighting in Sumy. So then redirecting one sort of seems counterintuitive to the entire idea. Although some elements of the 7th Corps have already been redirected to fight in Pokrovsk. So it would make a bit more sense if it was an element of the 7th Air Assault Corps, which consists of the 25th Brigade and also the 80th Brigade. So maybe it is the 80th, but I do know that over the past couple of weeks, there have been reports of deaths from the 80th, or missing persons reports from the 80th within Sumy. So it would have to be a spontaneous measure and one that occurred very not a long time ago. But that's just my educated guess. It could be totally wrong. Looking though at what I was going to refer to around Rodinska, we can see that the Russians are closing in from the north. So you have Ukrainian sources now mentioning that Sukhetsk is under intense Russian assault. Some Russian sources already allege that it is under their complete control, indicating an advance of nearly 6 square kilometers. There is undeniably now, and has been for the past 4 days, extreme DRG activity by the Russian side, not necessarily in Rodinska itself, but everywhere else surrounding it. So the northern flank has been the most pronounced, and especially near the rail line, whether it be Dorozhny or anything south of it, all the way to Shvedsk. DRGs were very active over here for the past 4 days. But today specifically, we had a change in the reporting because now it's being reported that the DRGs have expanded their reach all the way into Rodinska itself. So today, we have already information about DRGs, Russian forces, operating within the confines of Rodinska. That's not to say that it has fallen into Russian hands, but it does mean that the outer defenses are beginning to break down. And it's all happening from the north, which is what I sort of been talking about for the past week. The fact that the Ukrainians from 38th Brigade, for the most part, but also some National Guard units, have been able to pose successful defensive campaigns in the Krasno-Limanskaya mine and in Chervony Leman, although that's changing now. And that forced the Russians to change their outlook, and instead they've been concentrating their assaults on the open areas, the less well defended areas to the north. They've been able to establish control over windbreaks that give them a good operating points, and then from there they have an opportunity to move southwards. And you're also seeing that happen as the Russians begin to change the status quo around Chervony Liman, and they captured 40 hectares. You can see over here, August 3rd, a video from the 38th Marine Brigade wherein they fired an RPG into a basement that was housing Russians. And so we know that they're also pushing through here, although it is at a slow pace. It is pinning down some of the infantry that is needed for counterattacks in an area like Sukhatsk or in a windbreak. And so this two-pronged attack is posing a threat because now you're seeing how it can close in on Rodinska itself and also on the highway over here. The fall of this highway and the nearby junction will be the domino needed to sort of bring about the entire fall of the agglomeration, because from that point on you have a massive span of fields that are not necessarily the most defended, and even if they are, it's definitely not realistic for any sort of major squad of Ukrainian forces to be defending over here. So you're looking at basically an open area spanning about 8 kilometers that can be, first of all, dominated by a Russian aerial drone crews, UAV crews, throughout the entirety of the day. And then also an area where the Russians can embark upon offensive activities to Rishni and fully cut off the agglomeration. So they would just have an open season over here, and there would be no anchor through which to defend and no area for troops to be deployed to defend in such a scenario, which is why the Rodinska sector probably is actually the most significant threat right now, even compared to Pokrovsk, because at least in Pokrovsk, most of the information we have about the infiltrations are from DRGs, and it's not really shifted yet into being reinforcements. Once that happens, though, that's going to be another significant event. And we know that the 1,435th Motor Rifle Regiment is active around here. We know the 74th Brigade is here. We know that the 35th Brigade is here, etc. But regarding the northern flank, that is certainly concerning. And the fact that the majority of the reinforcements that have been moved into here are from the National Guard is also a concern. I haven't even mapped out all of the National Guard regiments that are deployed over here, but there are several of them. I think it's like 6 of them, if I'm not mistaken. And I do have some of them, like this one here, 35th National Guard Regiment. And they aren't even complete brigades. They're sort of these separate units that are made up of new recruits, sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel for forces. So they're less well equipped, you could imagine. They probably are less well trained. They were thrown into areas of the front line that they did not have the experience in, and now they are learner drivers while they're dealing with a really important sort of defensive activity or an order. So it's going to be difficult for them to do the sort of job that a regular whole size infantry brigade would have done had they been moved in from another location. So they're definitely not a one-for-one replacement and not a viable alternative for any sort of healthy defense in an area like Murorod or Pokrovsk. It's just a measure that's needed in order to send in some sort of manpower to fill up a certain area, which does sometimes look good on paper if they do have the sufficient forces. But even then, there are shortages, and that's why the regiments and not brigades or even battalions. And otherwise, they are obviously going to be National Guards, so they're not even within the structure of the armed forces of Ukraine. They're an entirely different branch, which is not as good in terms of its caliber. So that's a bit of a summary for the front line over here in Rodinska. I do want to say, though, that just to finish off, the Russians are getting control over massive chunks of high elevation, and Rodinska itself, for that matter, I believe is on lower elevation, but the entire highway that enters into the agglomeration is also on similar sort of ridge. That does give the Russians at least parity with the Ukrainians, but in some cases an advantage, because we do know that like Krishny, for instance, is on low elevation. The northern part of Murderhide is on low elevation, and that's a part of why the Russians are even advancing into Chervony Leman, because then they can have this access to arrive at the road over here south of Rodinska and take over some of the tactical heights. And they've already done that to a certain degree with the Terrakan over here falling into their hands. So that's a bit more on the situation in um, Pokrovsk. But let's move on over here. You can see this is from the basically Kleban Beek fronts. That's what we should refer to it now. You can see that north of Romanivka, the Russians captured 1.32 square kilometers of territory. From August 3rd, the Predator Police Brigade conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto infantry southeast of Alexander Kalinove, indicating in advance, let's see how much it amounts to in the vertical direction, about 1.1 kilometers moving up northwards. So the Russian forces are beginning to seize control over some of the open areas in between Alexander Kalinove and Sherchebenivka. And you can see how the news continues to tighten around the salient that is over here, sandwiched in between these two parts of the front line, that, as we continue reiterating in video after video, do have the sort of key objective, overarching goal of closing in on Konstantinivka. Let's look at Seversk, though, because there are some interesting updates from here. Russian forces have been able to take over at least these two polygons, although it could be more by now. I know some Ukrainian sources actually claim that everything south of Serbyanka is in a gray zone, and some Russian sources already have all this area marked as under their control. So I'm being very cautious with what I'm marking, and it's basically only done through geolocations in this area because there's a lot of ambiguity, and that's natural for an area like Seversk where there has not been much movement up until now. So the Russian forces just to the north of Verkhovno-Kamyansk have been able to strengthen their initial penetration points into the city, because you can see over here there's a bit of an opening, and regardless of that fact, the Ukrainian drone crews were unable to stop the Russians in their track as they conducted major armored assaults in this area. They were able to stop most of the armored assets, but some infantry dismounted and slipped through the cracks and have been able to pay for themselves a viable route to arrive at the outer trenches. And now the Russians are engaged in sabotage of these defenses and are trying to clear them out, which will pave the way for an entrance from the northeast. So that's the current endgame, and you can see how the salient is now beginning to strengthen with a capture of 1.95 square kilometers of territory. This video is from August 3rd of the 6th Motor Rifle Brigade capturing trenches that are located in this area and taking 2 Ukrainian soldiers POW. Furthermore, we have this video from the area south of Frihorivka, or not a video, but just a geolocation of nearly 5 square kilometers of territory falling into their hands. So now you're looking at the western part of Serbyanka, where the 81st Airborne Brigade is operating, and then this ridge region, because this is on high elevation, that amounts to about 11.5 square kilometers, that acts as a buffer, because the fall of this area would then give the Russians an enormous amount of leeway to push across a broad front part of the front line and overrun defenses and flank Seversk from the north. So you can see how those maneuvers are beginning to unfold, and how the Russians are actually serious about taking over Seversk this time. Despite the fact that the Ukrainians have a very tiny garrison, it is good in terms of its combat capabilities, but it can only go so far against the Third Combined Arms Army in this particular area, which consists of 6th and 7th Brigades and also the 123rd Brigade. So they're the main forces operating over here on the Russian side, and they are now attacking across multiple vectors. They've been able to already find weak points and are starting to exploit them. So again, there's only so much that can be done after 3 years of defending in this area. Obviously, at a certain point, there is a finitude to the amount of like buffer zone between the Russian line and Seversk itself. So zooming in over here west of Ivano-Darivka, we have a small updates, nearly 1 square kilometer of territory captured. And you can see over here the geolocation of the 123rd storming trenches west of Ivano-Darivka and destroying them systematically via FPVs or via just sappers mining the underground components. So this is a part of an effort to undermine the southern flank of Seversk and take over Vimka, and I believe as well some of these open fields that are connected to the next line of villages, which includes Vanivka, Parizhny, Kuzmianivka, etc. Because after Seversk, and I know that it's very premature to even look at it, but after Seversk, you do have this large chunk of territory that's completely open. It is on extremely high elevation, though. That's an advantage for the Ukrainians. So having access to it from a Russian perspective would be a massive victory. And I do think that this could actually connect to the current operations going on around Leman. Let's zoom in on them, actually. You can see over here in Leman that the Russian forces are beginning the process of clearing out Torske, which is the final major populated area east of the Jerebets River, still under Ukrainian control. You can see over here an advance of zero point 0.7 square kilometers, and then the main route of attack by the Russian side by the, I think here it's the, I don't remember. I think it's the 36th, yes, 36th Motor Rifle Regiment. They were able to push through the local ravine and arrive at the southern tip of Torska. Here you can see the geolocation for August 2nd of the flag being raised, but the center of the town still is contested, and it's pretty isolated now because it does not have connectivity with the southern part of the Zherbets bank or river, bridgehead rather. So all movement back and forth is done across the body of water, which is obviously going to be difficult. So the Russians are engaged in clearing out this final pocket of resistance, and also in the process bypassing a lot of Ukrainian DRGs and a lot of activity that remains in the Severyansky forest. There's really no reason for the Ukrainians, or rather the Russians, to try to go in head on and clear out these forested patches individually, because that's impossible. It is pretty much impossible, honestly. The best way to go about it would be to just circumvent them and create conditions where they're about to get encircled and then squeeze them out like that. And that's sort of what the Russians are doing over here with their maneuvers south of Torska. Because from there, I believe that there won't really be a centralized effort to clear out the forests, although it's possible the Ukrainians withdraw of their own volition at some point, and then the Russians obviously seize it. But the main objective of this vector would be to take advantage of the forested area. The Russians may end up using it for their own purposes of advancing further westwards, about 9 kilometers westwards, and arriving at Leman from the southern sort of flank. And the goal would not be to take it over from here, I believe, but definitely taking advantage of the cover of the forest. DRGs, in a similar manner to what they're doing now in Pokrovsk, would be able to begin causing a lot of havoc, undermining the rigidity of defense over here, and beginning to create gray zones within the city itself as attacks occur across other prongs at the same time, which is why this sort of outstretched flank over here is so important. Here you can see a map of the front line that I drew, and you could see how really sort of the maneuvers over here are developing. You could see how the Russian forces from Zelandolina have an opportunity now to get very close to Chandri, which, according to some reports by the Russian side, has already occurred, that there has already been a push from the northeast towards this town. I've not been able to verify that, so I've not changed the map to accommodate that claim. But the capture of Chandri would then give the Russians a lot of access to the key road networks that are essentially connecting to the Leman direction and to the eastern bank of the Jerebets River. So you can see those roads over here. There are not many of them. The road networks in this region, which is basically the backwater parts of Donetsk and Kharkiv, it's the southern part of Kharkiv, northern part of Donetsk. There's a lot of difficulties here with upkeeping roads, especially since the war started. There's not any sort of work done to repair them, and even regardless of the quantity, the quality, the quantity is just really poor over here. And a lot of the roads rely on the same nodes to connect them, and then from there branch out. And Chandri is a prime example. So the loss of it would be a massive victory for the Russian side, which would cut off almost entirely the connectivity of Leman with the northwestern flank, wherein you have all the movement coming in from the rest of the Kharkiv Oblast. There would only be a very narrow corridor that you could see marked over here between the Dnipro River and the village of Chandri. And then from there, the Russians would also have an opportunity to cut it down further by taking over Novoselivka, and then from there, Drobysheve, and then attack Leman from the unfortified northwestern flank. This could also be done in conjunction with attacks that we can see them over here from the higher elevated regions that are directly north of Leman, which are sandwiched in between two key villages. So in the process, the Russians would not actually be engaging in house fighting. They would simply advance to an open area and knock on the door of some of the fortifications, but do so in a way where they are control of the entirety of the dominant heights. And that's why it's so important that the Russians were able to get control over the salient and over much of its high elevation, this high ground region that gives it a perfect line of sight, a perfect vantage point to fire towards the Leman region that you can see over here. And not just Leman, but also all the other villages north of the Donetsk River, and ones that are even stretching a bit further westwards, like Debrova and Yampil a bit over here to the south. So it's all part of that sort of maneuver, I believe. And regarding the topographic map, let me open something for a moment. I'm thinking of creating an overlay feature that directly maps out the front line on a topographic map. So I created a topographic map essentially that does cater towards Ukraine in the sense that the red indicates the higher elevated parts of Ukraine, and the blue and the green indicates the lower elevated chunks of the country. So I'm just trying to get you guys' opinion on whether the polygon over here is actually see-through, or whether you can actually like distinguish the polygon over here, which would be like, for instance, Russian controlled territory, are able to distinguish this polygon from the colors that I drew for the topographic map for the high ground and the low ground, because it does not seem to me that it is distinguishable enough. And in that case, I probably wouldn't want to use this as a background for my map. So just give me your thoughts on it, or give me advice on how I can improve it, or whether I should use a different website like ArcGIS or QGIS or whatever. But just to recalibrate our focus, I do want to look at Kupiansk because we do have initial information, and maybe it will be verified in the coming hours. I'm not sure. Northwest of Kupiansk, there is information of the Russians entering into Moskova over here and towards the northern parts of the western district of Kupiansk directly within the city confines. So we do know that the Russians have been able to build up a very strong bridgehead across the Oskil, and how they've been able to maneuver southwards, southwestwards, and create a very strong northern flank. And from there, they were able to seize control over Kinrashivka, Holubivka, Radkivka, etc. But now this is a step forward because we're actually alleged to have arrived into the city confines, into areas that are more dense and more populated. So we'll see if that ends up being true. But establishing a sort of solid bridgehead that spans a wide parts of the city, the entire northern flank, would be the most favorable scenario for the Russians, because then it would be difficult for the Ukrainians to conduct a pinpointed counterattack. So just to give you guys a refresher, we did see a similar sort of infiltration by the Russians. I think that was last November, something of that sort. And the Russians did attack from Sinikivka and the forested areas, all the way southwards, past the armory, all the way into the eastern part of the city, near industrial zones, near apartments, etc. But it was eventually repelled because it was outstretched. It was not wide. It was very narrow across one singular corridor. And the Ukrainians do still have the ability to muster up the forces to counterattack in such a direction. The difference here is that, first of all, a lot of Ukrainian forces are fixated on holding the line to the east of the river, not necessarily to the west. That's one concern. So their forces are now split up, which they weren't previously. Also, the Russian attack over here appears to be more broad, and it's not focused on one particular vector and one corridor, meaning that it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to isolate the Russian attack to one area and then focus on just destroying that specific location. So those are my thoughts on this. You also have the fact that the Russians already have momentum over here. They have already been on the offensive in this location for several months now. So it would just be a continuation of previous storming operations of populated areas, which we didn't see last November. Last November, the front line was just static and just suddenly turned towards the Russian side, suddenly turned into a deep penetration. And the Russians were definitely not prepared for holding on to it. So the situation over here is fundamentally different, and we'll have to see how the Ukrainians end up coping with that fact. Looking at the Zaprozhia region, I do want to zoom in because the Ukrainians did counterattack, and we do need to mention the fact that they have sent in the 210th Assault Regiment Berlingo for that purpose. So they were able to take back this chunk of Plavny and also Kamyanske, amounting to 1.87 square kilometers of territory. They may have also pushed the Russians out of the microdistrict number 3 and all the way back to the border with Kamyanske. That's not verified yet, but is being alleged by Ukrainian sources, who say that the Russians have now shifted their focus to the northeastern flank of Kamyanske with the hope of just taking control over the ridges over here, and then from there sort of circling back and assaulting Stepnohirsk instead of a direct frontal assault on the city. So we'll have to see if that ends up bearing out. But definitely the Ukrainians have conducted a localized counterattack over here, which makes complete sense when you understand the fact that the Russians were on course to storm Stepnohirsk and then from there exploit a pretty wide opening, a pretty wide gap in the Ukrainian line that would have a lot of implications that we talked about before. So that's why infantry is needed for these sort of operations that can push back a force, that can hold the line when necessary. But the question is, how long can they actually do so, especially as the Russians are still very prominent at Kamyansk itself. You can see over here, this is a video from August 2nd. I don't know why I don't have it labeled, but it is a video of the Ukrainian forces as they pushed into this area being targeted by the Russian side. So this is just an update on the Plavny and Kamyansk region, and we'll finish off with, of course, the developments in Kherson, because we do know that the Russians engaged in a interesting bombing campaign in recent days. So August 2nd, which was yesterday, we saw for the first time a Russian fab strike on the bridges that enter and supply Kherson. So this is the bridge, and this was the geolocation of the first strike. And I'm writing that it's a Fab 3000 strike. I've seen others claim that it's a Fab 1500 with the UMPK kits. I really don't know the payload. I have no idea. I'm not well versed in that sort of basically extrapolating from an explosion what munition it actually is. But definitely, it's not a Fab 500. It was much larger in scale. So actually, this one did directly hit the bridge span, the one from August 2nd, and there was a smaller Fab 250 that hit the northern bank of the river over here and Kherson proper, which may have been unrelated, or maybe it was part of trying to strike the bridge. I'm not sure. But what we do know is that two fabs were dropped, and both of them hit in areas that were actually on land and on the river. Then on August 3rd, which is today, we saw that the Russian forces dropped four fabs, and they were apparently Fab 500, so they were smaller in terms of payload, but they were slightly more inaccurate than the Fab 1500 or 3000. The Fab from August 2nd did cause a major penetration. It hit directly in the center of the bend of the bridge and did cause some sort of significant damage to the specific area that was hit. But the span itself, the structure, all the other parts of the bridge that were not directly hit, that did not cave in on themselves, they're still standing and don't have any sort of difficulty. So there is still movement over here, which is why we saw a second round of bombing, and I think we'll see many more until it actually doesn't get destroyed. And that will be a lesson for us to sort of gauge how many times, how many rounds of fab strikes, and it has to be a fab strike, how many of them actually are able to destroy the bridges over here, which obviously are a product of Soviet architecture. We see a huge emphasis on the stability of the bridge and the concrete structure, concrete slabs that are holding it up. So it does have a very rigid structure, making it difficult to destroy. And that would go for any bridge. The Antitovsky Bridge had to be destroyed manually by Russian sappers that mined it. And now we're seeing over here that it takes multiple bombing runs of fabs that cause massive damage elsewhere to private residential houses, but not to apartments, by the way, because of the same sort of Soviet architecture. So over here, it takes multiple runs. So on August 3rd, we saw four dropped. Two of them hit their targets. One hit in an open area, or maybe it wasn't open. It was like just in a land area near a house. And then another one fell into the river, the Kosheva River. So this is in Korabel Island, and this is the Korabel River, or rather the Korabel Bridge. I apologize. And there are now the sort of initial stages of just rumors about the Russians trying to create the necessary conditions for a amphibious landing, not to take over Kherson, obviously, but to just get a bridgehead in Korabel. And I will just entertain it because I do think that we should have all our tracks covered and just get an understanding of everywhere across the front line. So in Korabel, we have a lot of residential apartment buildings. We have a massive industrial area in the northeastern parts of the island, and that includes an entire network of tunnels and underground mines. So that region can actually be exploited by the Russian forces. And I would juxtapose it to what happened in Krinky, because we also saw the Ukrainians embark upon a year-long amphibious landing, and it did not go the way they desired, because there was not a good way to supply their forces, and because there was no good cover, and basically the entire village was systematically destroyed. So over here, the situation is different in the sense that the cover over here is much more encompassing and much safer. But the other concern would be logistics. And we have seen with the Oskil bridgehead that the Russian forces, obviously Oskil is much more narrow, and drone activity in Kherson would probably be stronger and sort of cover a broader area. But regarding the Oskil bridgehead, the Russians have been able to resupply via drones. Drones are being used to move food, water, small ammo crates, and such. But heavier equipment is obviously has to be moved through pontoon bridges or previously existing bridges. But in an area like Korabel, you don't need heavy equipment, because you're looking at just infantry and forward operators that are trying to seize control over strong points and over regions that are on very low elevation and in dense urban areas. That's not an area where you actually have to employ armored vehicles, for instance. So I could see the steel man for why the Russians would want to take it over, just to have a forward base over here to harass Kherson. So obviously, just keep an eye out for it, I would say. And I will be doing more in detail investigations on the Ukrainian garrison in Kherson, because I do believe that it is pretty thin right now. The drone crews are pretty strong and do a lot of the heavy lifting, but the actual infantry and their sort of span, their sort of presence on the front line is diminished, and it has to be, because other fronts are much more important. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.